Hey there, ready to dive into something really interesting.
Hmm.
Today we're going behind the lines of an article called Our Reality Check.
Yep.
You know how the media often paints a very specific picture of a Trump supporter?
Right.
Well, this article flips the script.
Interesting.
It's a thought-provoking look at why someone, a Canadian observer actually,
Okay.
would be drawn to Trump's presidency.
And that's what's so fascinating about this, right?
Yeah,
It's not the typical us versus them narrative.
right.
This Canadian author sees something more nuanced, something valuable in Trump's approach, even admitting he wasn't perfect.
Exactly. It's less about the specific policies and more about what his presidency represented. So you ready to unpack this?
Let's do it.
Okay, so the article dives straight into what the author found so compelling about Trump, and it might surprise you.
Hmm.
It wasn't about the wall or the tweets. It was this love for America and a willingness to empower traditionalist viewpoints.
Hmm.
The author felt these qualities were more valuable than any specific policy win.
Interesting.
What do you make of that?
It's a really interesting angle because it challenges the prevailing narrative about Trump supporters being driven solely by policy.
Mm-hmm.
This author is saying, hold on, it's bigger than that. They were drawn to Trump's attitude, his audacity to challenge the establishment, and his vocal support for a segment of society that felt ignored.
It's like he gave a voice to the voiceless, right? Even if
Yeah.
you didn't agree with everything he said, the fact that he was saying it out loud was significant.
Absolutely.
Mm.
In fact, the author even argues that Trump's presidency broadened the spectrum of acceptable right-wing discourse.
Hmm.
Imagine a window of acceptable political ideas.
Okay.
Before Trump, that window, what we call the Overton window, was much narrower for right-leaning viewpoints.
Right.
This author felt that acceptable right-wing thought was often limited to things like neoliberal economics, which, while tolerated, were still seen as extreme by many.
Right.
Um,
So Trump essentially widens this window, making space for views that were previously considered fringe or taboo.
precisely.
Okay.
And it's here that the author throws us a real curveball, claiming that American conservatism is ultimately destined to lose.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
How so?
The author argues that both sides of the political spectrum at their core share the same foundational values. They use a thought-provoking example to illustrate this point, the civil rights movement versus the LGBTQ+ movement. Now, while conservatives might oppose the LGBTQ+ movement, they essentially use the same logic and tactics that were employed during the civil rights movement, a movement conservatives now largely champion.
So they're fighting against something they essentially agree with. That's fascinating and a little paradoxical, don't you think?
It is, and it speaks to the author's larger point that simply opposing the current iteration of progress isn't enough. They seem to be advocating for a more fundamental shift away from liberal values altogether.
Okay, so we've talked about Trump's appeal, the limits of conservatism, but we can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? January 6th. How does this article frame that event?
It's interesting, the author presents a very specific interpretation of the Capitol siege. They describe it as a desperate attempt by people who felt unheard and unrepresented to finally make their voices heard.
That's a perspective we don't often hear. It's usually framed as a blatant attack on democracy.
Right, and yet the author goes even further, suggesting that many of the participants were naive, truly believing they were acting patriotically.
So they weren't necessarily malicious, but rather caught up in a moment fueled by a sense of desperation and misguided patriotism. That's a really different take.
Exactly. And what's even more striking is the author's belief that the establishment, regardless of what actually transpired that day, will use January 6th as a way to further marginalize and punish conservatives.
It's like they're saying it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, that the events of that day, however misguided, simply gave those in power the justification they needed to crack down on dissent and delegitimize conservative viewpoints.
Exactly. It's almost as if the author believes that by giving a voice to those who felt silenced, Trump unintentionally handed the establishment the perfect excuse to silence them even further.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It is.
So even though the author sees this potential for increased marginalization, is there any glimmer of hope in their perspective?
There is. The author sees this act of defiance, however misguided, as exposing a vulnerability within the elite, a fear of mockery and disrespect.
Interesting. So even in defeat, they revealed something important about those in power.
Yes, and it ties into the author's final, and perhaps most thought-provoking point about the nature of power itself. They argue that true power doesn't reside in institutions or individuals, but in something higher.
I'm intrigued. What do they mean by that?
It's like they're saying the elite's claim to authority is ultimately illegitimate. Think of it like the emperor's new clothes. Everyone pretends he's magnificently dressed, but then one voice of dissent, one person pointing and laughing, exposes the absurdity of it all.
Right.
That's what the author sees in this challenge to the establishment.
So you're saying that by refusing to play by the rules, by mocking the elite and their narratives, these individuals, even in defeat, revealed a fragility at the core of that power.
Exactly. The author seems to believe that the true power of that moment of January 6th wasn't about achieving a specific political goal, but rather about disrupting the facade, about exposing the insecurity that underpins those in authority.
And that kind of exposure can be contagious, right? It
Yeah.
can inspire others to question the narratives they've been fed and to seek out different perspectives.
Absolutely. It chips away at the carefully constructed image of power and control.
This deep dive into the mind of this particular Trump supporter has really revealed something much larger about the dynamics of power, authority, and dissent in our current climate.
It's a powerful reminder that things aren't always as black and white as they seem, and that there are often deeper motivations and beliefs at play beneath the surface.
And understanding those motivations and beliefs, even when we might fundamentally disagree with them, is crucial if we want to bridge the divides in our society.
Right.
This article wasn't about endorsing a particular political stance, but rather about understanding a perspective we don't often hear explored in such depth.
That's saying one person's villain is another's hero.
Right.
It all comes down to perspective, doesn't it?
Exactly. And that's the heart of it all. We can't have meaningful conversations. We can't even begin to bridge those divides without at least trying to understand where the other side is coming from, even if ultimately we reach different conclusions.
It's about empathy, not necessarily agreement. It's about recognizing the humanity in those we perceive as different.
You nailed it. And that's what makes this article a reality check so thought-provoking. It wasn't a call to action, but a call to thought. A reminder that behind every headline, every political debate, there are complex human stories, a tapestry of experiences and perspectives.
Yeah.
And that's what we strive to do on the deep dive, right?
Yeah.
To go beyond the surface, to grapple with those different perspectives, and hopefully walk away with a more nuanced understanding of the world around us.
And I think this deep dive was a perfect example of that. We didn't just skim the surface. We dove into the deep end of a perspective that often gets demonized or dismissed. And in doing so, we uncovered some really insightful and, frankly, uncomfortable truths about power dissent and the stories we tell ourselves about the world.
Uncomfortable, yes, but essential. Because if we're not willing to confront these uncomfortable truths, if we're not willing to listen to those who see the world differently than we do, then we're only perpetuating the very divisions we claim to want to heal.
100%.
So as always, keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking out those diverse perspectives, and keep diving deep. Until next time.